Returning to the main subject of today, a few extra glyphs. The main one is ma. It's a little cut off here, but this is the sort of main form of the sign. So ma has no iconic references. What it does, it represents like a shiny stone, basically, with some attachments to it, like in a bundle of sorts. It's a very, very ancient sign, shared by Mayan and Olmec writing systems. And then this middle part can go, so you end up with just bottom and top parts. Those also serve as ma. But it's also a very tricky sign because early on, it seems to be used to also spell ba. Like the ma make no difference between ma and ba, which is a strange aspect of some early Maya texts. Later on, Maya scribes resolved this ambiguity by coming up with these two distinct ma and ba signs. So ma gets a funny face, and now it's definitely ma, and then ba gets modeled after that with a distinct element and dots. But these basic forms remain, and the lower part, the ambiguity between ma, ba, and then later on la kind of remains, which seems to be a thing in the script. Now, we looked at those examples when we discussed agentive pronouns, so like the agentive nouns and also like occupations, like people in the market, a tall person, a fine clay vessel person. A lot of them had this prefix up front. It's just one of those signs which are used grammatically primarily, just to form nouns, like he, she of something, the one who does something. And this is a more common variety of the same character that later on, because that h sound disappears from actual spoken language, they begin also using this as just a simple ah. And then we looked at that character a couple of times. That's a tooth with a jade inlay and saliva, like an incisor, and for some reason it has a second variant, which is a hand doing some kind of gesture. We understand Maya gestures not particularly well. There is a scholar who actually tries to connect these signs for hands and indigenous sign languages, because there are in fact indigenous sign languages in Yucatan. And so the idea is that they may actually have some common origin, like connected to writing, but it's very tricky. It's not as straightforward. I wish I could say like he created these beautiful charts and they make total sense, but unfortunately it's a bit more complicated than that. But it's a very tantalizing possibility that there's some kind of indigenous tradition that links sign languages for deaf people and these conventions of Maya writing, which link sign positions to certain meanings or words or syllables. Now, today is one of our grammar days, so we're getting further into grammar, and we'll start looking at verbs. But before we do that, it's always important to remember the syntax, right? So that we have so-called non-verbal predicates, because in English we have a verb to be, but in Mayan languages there's no verb to be. And so, ukab uchen hushbuluk pikahao, the 311 Bhaktan Lord, his land, his cave. It is the land, it is the cave of the 311 Bhaktan Lord. Tag Bahlam, red jaguar, could be like a tag, but could also be a statement. Jaguar is red. And remember, in Mayan languages, predicate, like verb or non-verbal predicate, is always at the beginning of the sentence, kind of exactly reverse of what you have in English. And then chumtun, stone sitting, could be like a caption to something, stone sitting. But it can also be a sentence. It is stone sitting. So that's something very important to remember. First, that the predicate is always up front. Jaguar is red. It is his land. And that a lot of these statements, they can be like tags, but they can also be sentences, depending on how we choose to interpret them. And then with the intransitive verbs, it's the verb and the subject. Lady Katun Lord was born. Siyak Ishwini Kabahao. His head became the mountain. his blood became the ocean or the pool. So verb, subject. And then when you have an attribute like an arrival into a place, arrives 3 wintik, yashko kmo. This is the subject of the sentence. This is the verb, and that's where he arrived. And you can technically take that ush wintik and place it at the end of the sentence. It will not change meaning that much. When you have transitive verbs, it's different. The transitive object had to be between the verb and the subject. And I color-coded it here so you can see it, right? So paints, kulub. Kulub is the subject, the agent, and he paints. So u up front has to agree with the subject of the sentence, right? So he paints it. In this case, it is 0. Painted it. Nikachmo, scattered fire. U has to agree with nikachmo. That's the subject of the sentence. So u refers to nikachmo. Choko, scattered. It, which is fire. So verb, object, subject. And of course, if you translate it literally, it's scattered fire nikachmo. So when we translate the text, we have to change the order of the words, right? So it would be nikachmo, scattered fire, as consistent with the order of words in English, right? So we have to move the subject up front. It's interesting, in present-day shortee, the subject is often up front, which is basically an influence of Spanish. So, but it also may be placed up front for emphasis. So as for nikachmo is scattered fire. And that kind of thing, we also see it in Mayan hieroglyphs. So an additional emphasis. Ut amau kawil bolon okte kuch. Bolon okte kuch, took or takes, kawil. So once again, u is in agreement with bolon okte kuch, bolon okte God. Zero dant is in agreement with kawil. Now you look at the sequence of godly names and you would wonder, how did Maya figure out that the subject actually begins here and the object ends there? And that's when the glyph blocks actually help, because they separate the predicate from the subject of the sentence. So the verb cham would often be combined with whatever the person is taking. And so that's the reason why those blocks actually work. They're just like spaces in our way of presenting words, but sometimes they separate things which reflect Mayan notion probably of predicates, right? How objects and verbs actually connect. In your assignment, you'll be looking at basic Maya sentences, which will be either intransitive verb with a subject or a transitive verb with an object and a subject. The other way to think about verbs is not in terms of subjects and objects, but agents and patients. It's a little bit better because it allows you to think of not parts of a sentence, but how verbs describe action. So in action, there is sometimes an agent from whom the action happens, right? And the patient at whom the action is directed, right? So any action has an agent or a patient. When actions have both, these are transitive verbs. So when a verb has an agent, somebody who does the action, and a patient, something or someone at whom the action is directed, that's a transitive verb. So Peter painted a chair. So Peter is agent. Peter painted something, a chair. That's a transitive verb. Now imagine that Peter painted for a week. Peter had a painted face. Peter painted. So there is still an agent, right? Someone paints, but actually there is no patient. It's not like Peter painted anything in particular. He just painted. So our transitive verb becomes intransitive, right? Because it lost its patient. The action is no longer directed at anyone. It's just activity. So it's a kind of a transitive verb. now. Now, in English, the word actually doesn't change, which is very confusing. But in Mayan languages, this form would be morphologically different. A special suffix would be added to it. And it would behave differently with the pronouns because it's now an intransitive verb. This part is more straightforward. The chair was painted. Now we miss the agent, right? The chair is the patient of action. And that's why it's helpful to think of agents and patients rather than subjects and objects, because the chair is the subject of the sentence, but it's the patient of the action, right? So the chair was painted. Here we don't have an agent. And of course, in this category, there may be other kinds of intransitive verbs when there is no agent. We can say the store closed. The store is not an agent in the sentence. It's still a patient. We can also say the chair got painted. And got painted and was painted, they both have no agent, but was painted implies that there was an agent somewhere out there, just not in this sentence. Someone actually did it. Got painted implies that it just happened by itself. So kids would say, something got broke. Right? It just happened. Or they may just say it broke with the same kind of connotation. Like no one did it. So in English, a lot of it happens contextually. You just have to guess from context. In Mayan languages, once again, there will be different grammatical markers indicating this different voice, like middle voice. So this would be passive, right? A passive voice. Action is directed at patient, but the agent is missing. This is something we would call anti-passive because it's the opposite of passive. There's just agent, but no patient. Like habitual action. Like guns don't kill, people kill, right? The same idea, right? Guns kill. They don't kill anyone, right? In general. People kill in general. So this will be anti-passive. As opposed to a person was killed, presumably by a gun. That's a passive voice. The person got killed, that's like somewhere what we call middle passive. So this chart is important because it gives you like a broad sense of what verbs are. And we can easily convert it to Mayan words. The chair was painted. And then Peter painted. But Peter painted a chair would be Peter. Do you see the difference between Peter and Peter? What is happening there? Exactly. The U, the ergative, is there. So Peter is marked by U here because he paints it, the chair. And the it is the absolutive pronoun. But unfortunately, for third person singular, it's just zero. So there's nothing there. But now, Peter paints is actually an intransitive form because there is no patient. Peter just paints. And the ergative pronoun disappears. Now that zero at the end refers to Peter and not to the chair. That's the tricky part because, of course, there's no clear analogy in English. Questions? Oh, okay. So this is where it gets tricky, and that's why it's so important to remember the pronouns. Because they kind of shift. And as you can see, there's a different ending here. There's an M. Tigban versus Tigban. So that is the grammatical marker of this anti-passive. And of course here, it's Tigbnach, which is the passive voice, was painted. And once again, here, Shumib is the zero at the end of the verb. The chair that was painted. This is the broad scheme of a Maya verbal paradigm in Cholan languages. This is the stem, the root of the verb. So in our case, it would be like verb, and then a would be a thematic suffix, ba. And then status is not marked in any of the examples that we've seen. Absolute pronoun would be 0. There's no modifier in all of the examples that we looked at. And then there'd be ergative pronoun. And in this case, that's the u up front. So u, verb, a. And then in this case, there's actual voice marker and for anti-passive. And then the 0. And then in this case, u for the transitive form. And there's no aspect prefix in all of the examples I gave you so far. Now the aspect part, oh yeah, the pronouns, just remember them. I'm just putting a slide with pronouns so that you know I'm serious about the pronouns. I actually mean it. The thing about Mayan languages is that Mayan languages don't have tenses. They don't have tenses. So I did it, I will do it, I do it. There's actually no difference in Mayan languages whatsoever. But they have aspects. And that's not the same thing as tense. There's a common anecdote about Maya Spanish, because as you can imagine, in places like Yucatan, there are a lot of Maya native speakers who speak Spanish, and they struggle with Spanish in a sort of structural way, because they have aspects but no tense, and of course Spanish, just like English, has tense but no aspect. And so a Maya person may say something like, busqué, busqué, pero no busqué. I searched and I didn't search. Can someone understand what's happening? Somebody says, I searched and I didn't search. I didn't find it. So because English or Spanish has no aspect, we use different verbs to express the idea of like accomplishment. Like search and find, actually different words. But for a speaker of a Mayan language or Russian, for example, search and find is actually the same word with different status markers or aspect markers. So for somebody who speaks a Mayan language, it's very difficult to understand that buscar, to search, and encontrar, to find, are different words. There's only one word in Mayan. That's the big challenge for us. With aspects, our problem is that there is a category that is missing in our language. We express it, of course, using different words, using particles, using means to kind of tell that we did something. We can say, but I tried, right? And somebody understands that it means that you did not succeed. Like in Russian or in Mayan, you can say, I did, but I didn't do it. Like, was it done? Someone asks. And you can say, well, it was being done. It was kind of done, but we didn't really finish it. And you can express this idea simply by changing the status markers on a verb in Mayan languages. So these are some of the basic aspects in Cherokee, and you can see that some of them, they look sort of like our tenses or like subjunctive mood, but that's not a perfect match, not a perfect analogy. So, int aqui, I cut it. Int akru, I cut it many times. So ru is a status marker of repetitive action. And once again, you can express this idea in English by adding an adverb, like I cut it repeatedly. But in case of the Maya, you don't need an adverb. You just put an extra suffix there. Warin aqui, I am cutting it. So our instinct would be to translate it as a continuous tense. Right? So I am cutting it, I was cutting it, I shall be cutting it. There is no difference, although the future tense is potentially different. But I am, or I was, or I have been, or I had, there is really no difference to a speaker of Mayan languages. In fact, to someone like myself, and Russian only has 3 tenses: past, present, and future. To me, understanding the difference between continuous, past, perfect, perfect continuous is very hard. I had to spend 3 or 4 years in school, basically, just try to figure that. Because there is no analogy, right? There's no analogy in my native language. I had to understand these categories externally. And so when we look at aspects, we can understand some of them as tenses, even though they're actually not. So var, int, aki, I'm cutting it in the sense that I cut it, and this is action that is still happening as we speak. So it could be also I have been cutting it, would have this sort of similar meaning. So in English, I am cutting it or I have been cutting it are different tenses, but for a speaker of the Maya, it's the same idea of an ongoing action. Ani chaki, I'd like to cut it. So it's optative, desirable action. And then if you say something like soft imperative, inch akik, you can see this is a suffix, which is also optative. That's more like you want somebody to do it, or you want yourself to do it. But it's more like a necessity than a desire. So rather than I'd like to cut it, this would be I should cut it. And then there's a direct imperative, cut it. Okay. So these are some of the basic aspect and status markers. And you can see the challenge for us is to understand, right? See the system. Some other examples. It's a little cut here. The word is perk, P-E-H-K, perk. And so perkna is he was cold, like summoned. Kokna, he was guarded. Chena, it was done. Chamesna, he, she was killed. There's like one letter cut here. So this is C-H-A-M, chamesna. And now when I say apekna, which is an incompletive, and in Chorti it's marked by a different pronoun, a set 3 pronoun, not by a suffix. So what's the difference between pekna, he was cold, versus apekna, he was cold in the incompletive? Can somebody tell me what would be the difference, do you think, between like he was cold, he was summoned in the completive aspect versus he was summoned in the incompletive? One possibility, like I called him many times, but I couldn't reach him. Like I called him, you would say. Like from intonations, you would understand when I say something like this, right? Did you call him and say, yeah, well, I called him, in the sense that I kept calling and nothing happened. Or you could say he was summoned once every Monday. Once again, it's not like one event that is completed, it's more like ongoing or habitual action. Or imagine you're watching a documentary about animals, and a lot of things would be happening in the incompletive. Like this animal may be found, this animal does this or does that. It's not like they all did it. It just keeps happening. So anything that is habitual, matter of fact, it happens in the incompletive by default. Because you're not describing a specific event. It's not over yet. And then, of course, it was done in the incompletive. It means, well, we tried, right? But we didn't really do it. So it's very hard to express this idea in English, right? Except adding something like, but I tried. So you say, did you do it? I tried. But a Maya person would say, like, I did it, or I did it in the incompletive. And the other speaker would immediately understand what's actually going on. He was killed in the incompletive. One possibility when you describe some action that happened repeatedly, about, say, danger, like cholera was killing people. A lot of people were killed by cholera. In the sense that not like a single event, but just kept happening, like epidemics. It can also be potentially indicative of someone attempting on the person's life, but failing. Like he was being killed, but he didn't die. Although that is less likely. At least doesn't ring right to me. Kormar, hunter. Mat uk nothing. Utahui, found. Tia, where. War korma, where he is or was hunting. So was hunting is incompletive. because he actually didn't find anything, right? He just hunted. But he didn't hunt anything. He didn't hunt anything down, as we would say. In English, we would use a preposition. To hunt something down, that's definite. That's accomplished. And so he found nothing. So found is in the completive because he already found nothing. It's over. Yakan atahwinsa tashukur. The shrimp or river shrimp are found in the river. So yakan is shrimp. Are found, it's actually atahwin, intransitivized with a media passive. Like it can be found, may be found. Sort of agentless. But it's in the incompletive because it's a general statement. You can find them in the river. It's not like all, if I wanted to say all the shrimps were found in the river, that would be in the completive. There's nothing left. Oh, they're all found in the river. Or in this case, tahwina e wakash, the cow was found. Of course, wakash is from Spanish bakash. And because they all spoke with Castilian accent, there's the sh sound there. Wakash. And for some reason, it's in plural, because that's how the Spaniards talked about cows, always in plural, I guess, in the presence of the locals. So, tahwina e wakash, umene afium, by the owner, who she, or what, that, I think they're talking about the cow, satpa agbita kopot. So the cow that got lost yesterday, so obviously the cow got lost, that's an accomplished fact. It's not like it kept getting lost, although that's a possibility, but since it only happened yesterday, not like every day of the week, that's a completive. First, it got lost, it definitely happened, it's over, and then it got found, same thing, it just happened, it's done, it's accomplished. So it's interesting that, once again, we can think about these things as tenses. There are no tenses in this sentence. It could be is found, gets lost. There's no difference to speaker of my language. The only thing that indicates time is yesterday from the sentence. It could be something that happened today, 2 years ago. And then somebody would say 2 years ago, or they would say a long time ago. And that's the only way to indicate tense or time in the narrative. The problem is we actually don't quite know how it all worked out in the language of classic Mayan inscription. So I gave you examples from Chorti, because that's the language I know a little bit, and it's very close to the language of my hieroglyphs. But linguists cannot agree what was going on with Maya hieroglyphs. There are essentially two theories. One theory is that at some point, about the time when the speakers of Cholan languages invented Maya writing, the language itself developed tenses and did not really distinguish between aspects. And then by the time the Spaniards arrived, the tenses disappeared and aspects returned. So that's the theory proposed by John Robertson and still followed by his students at UT Austin. The big cluster of Maya epigraphers are basically proponents of that theory. The second theory is pretty much shared by most linguists who work in the Maya area, in many epigraphers in the United States and in Europe, including yours truly. And that theory argues that, well, there were still aspects in the classic period, very much like they are today in the Cholan languages, and in fact they can be reconstructed and perhaps found in Maya hieroglyphs. So the thing about Maya aspect and status markers, when you think about it, we don't have a lot of good samples of Maya aspect markers because most of the inscriptions really discuss things that just happened. When you have a lot of dates and events, don't really expect things to be incomplete or ongoing. Because if something already has a date and it happened 20 years ago, well, it happened. So it's all in the completive for the most part. When we do find aspects is when people are talking to each other, when there are like captions for people talking. But those cases are rare, as you already know. That's why we have so few personal pronouns. This is the same problem. Or occasionally when there's rhetorical flourishes of some sort. The narrative diverges from the typical sort of he did, she did, and ventures into the realm of poetry. Those examples, unfortunately, are also rare. So, Wayakao, he is given it. Can you imagine where would somebody put that? He is given it. Like now, ongoing. Yeah, like progressive, incompletive, ongoing. How would you put a marker? Like ongoing status, incompletive. Where would you think you would see something like this?
Yes, in coordination with an image that shows him.
Close. It's on the steps of a throne depicted in a scene. So the king sits on a throne, and the steps are decorated with references to something that is happening. The attendant is bringing tribute, and it says he is given it, and then like feathers and jaguar pelts and cacao beans. So it's interesting that it's clearly meant to be immediate, right? This is something that is happening now, and we don't even see the objects themselves. I guess they're about to appear.
So it sort of acts as like a caption for.
Exactly, and it kind of builds anticipation, right? We don't see the objects, we assume they're coming. In the same way, Why Yalao, he is saying it. They could have said he said it, but that would mean that this is it. This is the entire thing that he said. But when they say Why Yalao, it means we're looking at a moment in conversation, right? So he's saying this means that he's going to keep saying things. That what we see is just an introduction of sorts, not the end of the story, not the end of the monologue. And in fact, they're about to start celebrating, and it kind of makes sense that they really want to emphasize this is just part of what was said, part of the narrative. We just get a glimpse, and then the veil falls, and we don't know what happened. Shah, already, like again, and it's interesting, this is an inscription left by a pilgrim to a cave. Or a vase. I think this is a birth vase, and it probably refers to a woman traveling. And it's not a very common narrative. And we have cave inscriptions too, which describe like repeated visits. And then this part is on that jade vessel. So already he drinks, so in fact, already he is in the act of drinking, the perfective form. And the assumption is that the person is dead, reborn, and then already he drinks. And this object is not meant for casual consumption. I don't think you can actually drink out of it. Jade plated wooden vessel, specifically made for basically afterlife. So this is poetry. And once again, takes things out of the usual context. It's not about things that happened. It's actually about things that happen on the other side in afterlife. He drinks cacao again, or already. So these are reconstructions. This is the John Robertson and students hypothesis. So we only have past and present. And there was an earlier marker that basically gave way to this past tense E. And then in the Kaufman and Norman's original reconstruction of Chol and morphology, they say there is still a difference between incompletive, completive, and imperative. And the most important part is that there is a variation based on what kind of verb it is. So in transitive verbs, you get L in the incompletive and E in the completive. And then with transitive verbs, it depends on whether they are basic root transitives, like consonant, vowel, consonant, the most sort of typical root structure for my verbs, or something else, like irregulars or derived verbs. And so for irregulars, you get vowel N for the incompletive and no marker for completive. And for root transitives, there's actually some marking or perhaps no difference whatsoever between completive or incompletive. So kind of similar to that. You can see these charts, they kind of match. But then Kaufman and Norman's model assumes that for some derived transitive, you will still see the difference. And for all the intransitive verbs, you'll still see the difference between the aspects. As for the E, they argue that this is a clitic. Now, clitic is different from tense. Clitic is a particle that you put at the end of a word that is used to indicate that it is related to something else in the sentence. So we translate it in English as for, or as I entered the room, I said, or as long as I was in the room, I did, or 2 days since I finished this project, I went. So those words, those additional words we use in English, they can be expressed by means of the clitic. And that, of course, implies that it is not clearly connected to aspects, although preferably it will be with completive aspect, but not necessarily so, and that it would not be particularly related to tense. So we have these two different theories, and none of them is sort of prevailing at the moment. I know that's a little unfair to throw it all on you, but that's just the way it is with Maya grammar. So this is what you would see in David Stewart's writings on verbs, including the introduction to Maya hieroglyphs, hieroglyphic grammar in the readings. Uhti, 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 it happens. Uhti, it happened. So E supposedly marks past tense. And then uhtom, it shall happen. It will happen. A definitive future. So that's okay. Like we don't see any kind of other forms of uhti. Now, the problem is, of course, uhti in the incompletive would be very hard to find in my hieroglyphs because you would need something that just kept happening repeatedly, like a matter of fact. And most of the texts, they don't really discuss things. If something already has a date, it's just a single event. Or you would need potentially something that is ongoing, is happening now, and that is potentially possible in a scene, but so far hasn't been attested, like as a caption to an event. For the most part, Maya scribes preferred predicates without verbs for those situations, like uba, this is the image of, and then you would have something going on. The problem, of course, with this interpretation is figuring out what is going on with these like unmarked things like uhti. Are they completive and completive? Are they present? Are they past? Why sometimes we see verbs with and without that e thing inside the same sentence? And why we get this vowel ch suffix occasionally with verb e. So we get verb e and then verb he. Like what is actually going on there? The tense model sometimes doesn't work very well when we would think it should work best. So there is that bunny, remember, the dirty bunny, the swearing bunny. He stole all the clothes from the Itzamat, from the god who lives in a mountain and has all the riches. So the god is complaining, the rabbit, he stole my clothes by thief, by tribute. You would expect that that would be past tense. But no, if we apply the John Robertson's model, it has to be the present tense. And it makes very little sense. Steve Houston tried to argue that it has something to do with the fact that some actions are ongoing. That the king will always win. The king will always dedicate monuments. But it doesn't work for this particular context. Because you have two distinct scenes. Now, if there is no tense here whatsoever, and it's just aspect, and there's no distinction between completive and incompletive because it's a consonant vowel, consonant verb, it actually works just fine. For some of the derived transitive verbs, like to say something, we actually have three forms, at least three forms. So the progressive wa yalao, completive or perfective yala, and then something that looks suspiciously like the incompletive as reconstructed by Kaufman, yalan. So this would be, he says, like, but he didn't finish saying, now, saying. And then wa yalao, he is saying, and it'll go in action, incompletive. And then yala, he said, or that's what he's saying was. So that's consistent with basically aspect, and doesn't work well for the tense model, but more like the aspects as reconstructed by Kaufman. Then we have these particles that David Stewart, for example, and his colleagues argue are a proof that the e suffix refers to time. So we have 2 days ago, earlier today, 15 days ago, he, ich, and then sahmi. The problem is that these are not verbs at all. So if that e thing is a clitic, that it can be attached to something that is an earlier related action, it works just fine. And that's another problem with the argument. And then of course you have this. So it's a sentence, it contains multiple verbs. You would expect that if all those verbs are tense-based system, there will be an agreement of tense between the verbs because they all happened on the same date. What you have instead, you have one of them is with a clitic. And as a clitic, it makes perfect sense. He closed, he completed the 14 20-year cycles as it happened at the Kukulnal place. So as a clitic, it makes sense. As a tense, it doesn't because both events are, he closed the 14 20-year cycles, and that's what happened at that place. He placed it in order, or he put it in order. He plotted it. So once again, if it's all in completive, that makes perfect sense. If it's all in different tenses, then it's really strange to see for like one sentence, for the same sentence, basically. And it is all in the same sentence, in the sequence. These are things he did, basically, one after another. For the intransitive verbs, once again, we see the same structure of suffixes as predicted by the aspect reconstruction. So, Achnel, he, she runs, incompletive, like tried to run but was caught, or like runs every period of time of some sort, but in this case, most likely tried to run away in that sense. And then Achni ran, like accomplished action, completed action. And then Achni, since he, she ran, or as he or she ran away. So with the clitic. Bishnel, he, she goes, kind of unfinished action, or he, she went, but unfinished action, so perhaps didn't reach the destination, or was still going when the person was reporting that. And then Bishin, he, she went and reached the destination, right? Accomplished the action. And then Bishni, same thing here, but in reference to something else, like as he, she went, or since he, she went. So all of these, they seem to conform to the aspect system. So you have incompletive, action that is still ongoing, or action that was not successful. He ran, but he didn't run successfully. Or he went, but he didn't reach the destination in that sense. Or he kept going there. That's another possibility, like every Monday. So that's exactly what we see with these suffixes. Some verbs, they don't have aspects, but once again, that may be just contextual, like what these verbs usually mean. When somebody dies, you really need a text that describes someone dying, like every day or right now. So chances are, most of the time, would be someone definitely died, just died. It happened. It's completed. Entered, same thing, right? Unless it's someone who tries to enter, but for some reason failed, or did it repeatedly, like habitually. So those potential contexts are not very likely. Same thing for arriving. Like either it's someone who is arriving but hasn't arrived yet, or someone who is habitually arriving somewhere. And all of these are less likely, basically, in terms of what the text would usually talk about. So they're all in the completive voice. Or with the clitic, as, or since he, she went, as, or since he, she died, as, or since he, she entered. So those also make perfect sense. There are still some really weird forms, and it looks like some nominalizations. When people add a lot of suffixes, those are rare. Awuleli, since your arrival. So you have your, wul, wuhul with the glide, and then another suffix here, l, and then e, awuleli, and it cannot be just incompletive because you have an ergative right there, your arrival. And then this is another arrival, but it's ulel and then ihi. You get the ich and you get e at the end. Since the arrival, most likely, or since arriving. Fortunately, that's the only example. Nobody ever wrote something like that. And it's interesting that they're from the opposite ends of the Maya world. This is extreme sort of southeast, and this is northwest. So those almost make dialectal differences too.
I think these are people showing off their knowledge of this prestige language.
It is possible. It is possible. This is actually a speech. It's more like casual, but it's interesting that the same speech contains different aspects. So it's really about, it's a parrot telling someone that they arrived in their nest, in their abode. Yeah, and the shell says, so the parrot says, said the shell. And the idea is that whatever the parrot says is not actually the case. He claims to be the owner, while he in fact just a domestic animal. So there the aspect is very important because that's part of the joke. Like who says what, basically. And basically arrival is also important because someone arrives and the parrot is talking about it. In this case, yeah, it's on an altar, so maybe someone is really showing off. Or someone is struggling with grammar. We should never discard that possibility. Because, provincial school, end of the classic period, times are rough. They just lost half of the kingdom 30 years ago. Well, not just, but, and, maybe it had some consequences on the training of some scribes.
Got the B squad out there making inscriptions.
That's how somebody finds volunteers for the next cycle of human sacrifices, when the king drops by and sees verbs like that. Now, we do have earlier markers, which is a, which should be like an early completive suffix. The problem is that our two linguistic camps, they see it as evidence of their specific interpretation. So John Robertson and his colleagues, they say, well, that's a sign that E is in fact a tense marker because that A became E. So the aspect marker became a tense suffix, while the other camp says, no, that just became the E completive. And E is something totally unrelated. So unfortunately, when there's not enough data, people keep arguing. And believe it or not, this is true for any Asian language. Whether I'm talking about ancient Egyptian Coptic, or ancient Sumerian, or ancient Akkadian, or ancient Chinese, these kinds of discussions will be common. This is basically, when people work with Asian languages, this kind of stuff happens all the time. It's a matter of uncertainty. The only language when it doesn't happen is probably Latin and Asian, because we have such an overwhelming set of documents that we don't really argue much about grammar, even though there's still questions of translation. So with a lot of transitive verbs, there doesn't seem to be much of a difference between aspects, right? He took, he summoned, he planted, most likely in the completive aspect, but reconstructions tell us from either camp, regardless, there would be no difference, whether it's present or past tense, or whether it's completive and completive aspect. We're not going to see anything. It will always be the same suffix and no additional markers at the end. So he bound the stone, and the thing is, we can always translate it as he binds the stone. There'll be no difference to a speaker of Mayan languages, of course. So we, as speakers of English, have to assume a slightly more creative approach here, based on context, and choose to translate it, for example, in past tense. There's a separate form, what we call perfective. I guess it could also, it's something closer to gerund, basically. It's like uchokoch. Sorry, it's kind of cut right here with the u syllables would have been. So uchokoch, he scattered, but it's actually close to it has been his scattering. Uchokoch. So there is a vowel nominalized. It seems to be the same suffix here. And this is probably the same thing with I, but he kind of dropped out. Uchuki, since he captured him. And that nominalizer we also see with, the non-CVC transitive verbs. I already showed you those. Yalan, incompletive, he said it. Yalahi, since he said it, but done. Yalach, he said it, but without the clitic, without since or as. And then we have a couple of there's one utakbun, as he puts it in order, but he hasn't finished it yet. And as you can imagine, that's rare and occurs only once. The entire corpus, it's a strange text from the northeasternmost major Maya city of Koba. The text goes in a spiral. There's only one date, and then a lot of things are happening, different verbs, and it's in that sequence. So it seems to be a description of some kind of ritual, and this is probably like at the top of an altar. So maybe they really want to emphasize this is something that the king does, either habitually, like all the time, or perhaps that very moment. It's not finished yet. The act of ordering, the fact of placing things in order. And this is the opposite. Akbuch, like he put it in order, like completed, perfected, done. Akbuch. So these are derived transitives. And then the same vowel suffix appears with nominalization. So we have like ma'ich, gift. That ich thing refers to like gifting or the act of gifting. So you have ma'chil bak, gifting bone, or yotot uma'ich, the box of his gift, in the sense of the bloodletting tools, of course, because you remember when they say they gift, it's usually when they're giving their blood. So gifting bone is a bloodletting bone. Gifting box is a box for bloodletting tools. But it's interesting that we have the same suffix, this vowel that occurs with transitive verbs. And it seems to basically create a gerund-like thing, except, of course, in English, gerund, you're not supposed to add anything to it. So you not say like giftingness or gifting ship. Sounds awkward. And here you can. So you can say ma'ich and then ma'chil when it's possessed. So where does it all leave us? Means it's a kind of tough summary here. Intransitive verbs are nearly always in the completive. That's what we expect. And most transitive verbs, of course, are almost always in the completive, but there seems to be no distinction between completive and incompletive with most of the transitive verbs, at least those which are consonant vowel consonants. But we do have this perfective form that seems to function like gerund of sorts. For the derived, for the non-consonant vowel consonant transitive verbs, we do see occasional ends that seem to indicate incompletive aspect. And then we have forms with the perfective, and all of these verbs can take clitics, which, of course, John Robertson interprets as the past tense marker. The fact that most of the verbs are in completive, or they're just the kinds of verbs where the aspect is not particularly well marked, shouldn't be surprising, as I mentioned again and again, given the kind of text that we have. Most of them have dates and events, things which already happened. So there is no reason to emphasize the ongoing nature or expected nature of the events. We have such a small sample of first-person conversations between Maya nobles or Maya gods that context in which people can evoke aspects are rare. It's no surprise that, for example, we have this single speech of maybe 30 words of God, of this guy as the celestial king of gods, to his minions, and that speech alone contains 2 personal pronouns unattested previously, like bishwahon and et. It also contains the only bishnel, he went in the incompletive, But that's no surprise. It's just once you shift the genres, then suddenly you start getting things which are different. But most of the time, we're dealing with royal monuments presenting us with a fait accompli, with things already done, over, finished. So they're all third person singular, and they're all in the completive. So it has more to do with genres, but of course it doesn't resolve these debates between linguists. So I wish my text could provide definitive evidence of say, a lot of incompletive forms with clitic, because that would certainly show people that the clitics are really clitic, like, and not markers of tense. But it hasn't happened yet, and probably is unlikely to happen in the near future unless somebody really finds a lot of beautiful pottery vessels with like mythical scenes and lengthy dialogues between the characters. It's all possible, but it's not as likely as I wish it could be. So I believe, more in the aspect system. And once again, there's no analogy to aspects in the English language, right? So the fact that speakers of Maya languages today and presumably in the past classify action in terms of how successful, how complete it is, as opposed to where it is in time in relation to your other actions or yourself. So there is, for the intransitive verbs, right? So we have incompletive and completive forms, and the incompletive seems to have the suffix L, and the completive seems to have a suffix E. So, achnel, he runs, achni, he ran, like already done, finished running. As you see, I translate aspects as tenses sometimes because there's no good analogy in English. You just have to do what you can do with what you've got in terms of the vocabulary and the grammar that English has. And so there you have examples with, of course, clitic, which would be like, although we don't have achnel li, it's theoretically possible, as he runs, or as he finished running, or ran successfully. Running usually appears in reference to defeated enemies, so it'll be like somebody escaped and then he ran somewhere. Running is a directional verb, so you cannot run from, you can only run to. So running away would actually be a different verb in Mayan languages. So in English, search and find are different words because there is no way to express aspect grammatically. And in Mayan languages, because they don't use a lot of prepositions and never had cases, they're more analytical. To run from and to run to are actually different verbs. To run from, to escape is lokoi, and to run is achni, to run to something. But it just happens. So for transitive verbs, right? So we have the derived transitives where we have vowel an in the incompletive, then no completive marker, and then we have this perfective with vowel ch. And all of these forms can have clitics attached to them. So when you are inside a more complex phrase and you compare events which happened, as in he closed 14 20-year periods. Utsutu Chanlahun Winikab. It happened in Kukulnal. Uhti Kukulnal. So the E there is basically cluing you that whatever happened is that closing of the 14 20-year periods. Any questions? I know it's hard. This is grammar. This is verbs. But there's no way to learn writing and visual culture without knowing a little bit of language. And this is probably the most difficult part about Maya grammar, the fact that there are aspects and no tense, and they have their own markers. But in practice, I mean, the good news is that a lot of these markers are just zero. There would be like no extra suffixes. And most of the inscriptions would be like in a single aspect, just completive. And most of the time in just active or passive voice. We haven't discussed voices yet, of course, the anti-passive, media passive, but we'll get there. For now, the only comforting information I can give you that most of the inscription will be completive. They'll have no additional suffixes. And translating remains mostly a contextual business because we have to adjust it to our own grammar, our own way of thinking about things, which is more time rather than the degree of accomplishment. So when we translate, that's why I'm saying that translation is always a creative process. It's an extra level of interpretation, and we have to base it on context. But the same problem obviously is faced by anyone who tries to translate from present-day Chortee, right? So if I translate a modern Chortee text, I'll be faced with the same challenge, trying to understand what's going on. Or try to imagine a conversation with any Chortee person. You have to remember there are no tense markers, right? So you have to look for additional parts of the sentence to understand when things are actually happening, right? Are they happening right now? Or are they happening a day ago, a year ago? The verb itself is not going to help you with that. But then you can express other things like a degree of accomplishment, which I find very, very convenient as it aligns better with my own native language.